She never dreamed of riches. She just wanted her father to stop calling her a disgrace. But that night, under crystal lights and whispers of strangers, he sold her like property. No one spoke up. No one except one man. Keep watching to find out what happens next. This story will surprise you. And thanks for subscribing. The hotel ballroom in Buckhead was large, bright, and full of noise. The floor shined like glass, and the air smelled of expensive perfume and alcohol. Emily followed her father through the crowd, trying not to stumble in the shoes that were too high for her. The dress he made her wear was tight and uncomfortable. It pressed against her waist, and every movement reminded her how much she didn't belong there. Her hands were shaking, but she kept walking because her father told her to. People around them laughed, talked about business, and took pictures with fake smiles. The men wore dark suits, the women wore glittering dresses. Waiters moved quietly between them with trays of champagne and shrimp cocktails. Music played softly in the background. Emily tried to focus on the sound instead of the whispers she heard as she passed. She knew what they were saying about her. Her father seemed different that night. He was too loud, too excited, trying to act richer and more confident than he really was. His shirt collar was damp from sweat, and his breath smelled like whiskey. He had debts he couldn't pay, and she knew it. He had been angry for weeks, slamming doors and making calls late into the night. Tonight he saw a chance to fix everything, and she could feel it in the way he gripped her arm. At the front of the room, a man was giving a speech about charity and community projects. People clapped politely. Emily stared at the chandeliers above, wishing she could disappear. But when she looked back at her father, she saw something change in his face. He raised his glass and started talking to a group of men nearby. His words got faster, louder, and then suddenly he laughed, a dry, sharp laugh that didn't sound real. The laughter around them stopped when he said what he said next. Emily didn't understand at first, and then she did. He was offering her not as a joke, not as a figure of speech, but as a deal. He said she was a burden, that she could be useful to someone who had money. The room went quiet. Some people looked away. Some smiled awkwardly and sipped their drinks. Emily stood frozen, her heart beating too fast to think. Then one man stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. He was tall, maybe in his early 30s, wearing a simple dark suit that fit him perfectly. His blonde hair was neat, brushed back from his face, and his expression didn't change as he approached. He didn't laugh, didn't hesitate. He took out a checkbook, wrote something on it, and handed it to her father. No one said a word. Her father's face softened into greedy relief, his fingers tightening around the check as if it were gold. The stranger glanced at Emily for just a moment, not with pity, not with interest, but with quiet focus, like he was making a decision he had already accepted. Then he nodded to his driver, who was waiting near the door. Her father pushed her forward and told her to go. She didn't move at first. The voices in the room started again, but now they sounded far away, muffled by the pounding in her chest. Outside, the night air felt cold after the heavy heat of the ballroom. The driver opened the door to a black car and waited. Emily sat inside, staring out the window as the hotel lights faded behind her. The city passed by tall buildings, neon signs, empty sidewalks. Her hands were still shaking. She didn't know where she was going or why that man had stepped in. All she knew was that her father had sold her and no one had stopped him. When the car turned off the main road and headed toward the dark hills beyond the city, she finally understood. Whatever her life had been before that night was over. What waited ahead was unknown, silent, and impossible to escape. The mansion on the north side of the city was large but quiet. It wasn't a palace like Emily expected. There were no gold walls, no servants rushing around, and no noise. The rooms were clean and almost empty. The tall windows let in soft light during the day, and at night the hallways were filled with silence. Every sound she made, her steps, the opening of a door, the running water, echoed like it didn't belong there. The man from the gala, Mr. Holt, barely spoke to her. He wasn't rude, but he kept his distance. Most of the time he was gone during the day, and when he was home, he worked in his office. He left notes on the kitchen counter, short and polite. They said when the driver would come, when groceries would arrive, and that she could use anything in the house. The notes were signed with only his initials. Emily didn't know what to do with all the space. Her room was big and plain, with white walls and a bed so large she felt small in it. The bathroom had everything she could need, but it felt more like a hotel than a home. On the first morning, she found clothes folded neatly in the wardrobe, simple jeans, soft sweaters, shoes that fit her perfectly. Someone had prepared them ahead of time. The kitchen had meals stored in containers, chicken, vegetables, rice, and salad. She wondered how he knew what she liked. At first, she was afraid to touch anything. She walked carefully, as if someone might appear and tell her she didn't belong there. But days passed, and no one did. The house stayed quiet. She started cooking for herself, reading in the library, and walking through the garden in the afternoons. The garden was overgrown but peaceful, with mint, lavender, and tall trees that swayed slowly in the wind. Sometimes at night, she heard sounds from Mr. Holt's office, a low voice like he was talking to someone, but there was never an answer. Other times, she heard the back door open and close, and the sound of footsteps fading down the long driveway. In the mornings, she noticed that his running shoes were left by the door, still wet with dew, and his hands had small scratches, as if from tree branches. He always looked tired when she saw him, but not unkind. Emily still didn't understand why he had taken her from the hotel that night. He hadn't tried to control her or hurt her. He hadn't even looked at her the way men usually did. It was as if he had brought her there for a reason he couldn't explain, not even to himself. Over time, the house started to feel less cold. She opened the curtains every morning, filled the rooms with light, and placed books on the empty shelves. She brewed tea in the kitchen and sometimes opened the piano lid, pressing one or two keys just to hear the sound. The walls didn't feel as heavy anymore. She still didn't know what kind of man Alexander Holt really was, but she sensed he wasn't cruel. The silence between them wasn't threatening, it was cautious, like they were both learning how to live in it. For the first time in a long while, Emily could breathe without waiting for someone to yell or demand something from her. The mansion was still too big and too quiet, but she began to think that maybe the quiet wasn't meant to trap her. Maybe it was giving her space to start again. The quiet rhythm of the house started to change. Emily began noticing small things that didn't fit. At night, cars came up the driveway and stopped near the side entrance. The people who stepped out wore dark clothes, hats, or hoods that hid their faces. They never stayed long. Sometimes she heard the faint sound of voices behind the closed doors of Alexander's office, but the words were impossible to understand. Other nights, she saw light coming from under the door, and the shadow of his movement pacing back and forth. One evening, she passed by his office and heard the sound of a safe opening, but not the usual loud click, more like a silent mechanism. When she peeked through the half-open door later, the safe was closed again. There was a small pile of folders on his desk, sealed in brown envelopes. He always locked the room when he left, but once he forgot, and curiosity made her step inside. The folders were filled with documents, contracts, letters, and copies of financial records. She didn't understand most of it, but one thing caught her attention: several payments sent to charity organizations that didn't exist in Georgia. The names sounded real but unfamiliar. One of the documents mentioned medical supply chains and clinics around Atlanta. The more she read, the more she realized that these charities were only a cover for something else. A few papers had a signature she recognized instantly. It was her father's name. The handwriting was exactly the same as on the notes he used to leave her at home. Her hands started shaking. She put the folder back and sat down at the edge of the desk. It felt as if her past had broken into this quiet house and found her again. She couldn't understand what connection there was between Alexander and her father. The man who had bought her, who treated her with distant kindness, was somehow linked to the same world of debts and corruption her father had been drowning in. But instead of fear, she felt confusion. Alexander didn't act like someone hiding crimes. He didn't live like a man who had something to gain. Over the next few days, she began paying more attention. When Alexander left late at night, he didn't go to parties or meetings. He met with the same people who came to the house after dark. Once, she saw him hand over a sealed envelope to a man in a gray jacket near the gate. They spoke briefly, and then the man drove off without headlights for the first few miles. Emily started piecing things together slowly. The fake charities, the medical contracts, the hidden visitors, it wasn't about money. It looked more like he was helping someone, maybe even protecting them. The more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Her father's name appeared on documents tied to the distribution of illegal drugs disguised as medical aid. Maybe Alexander had discovered this and was trying to stop it quietly, without public scandal. The thought frightened her. If he was working against people like her father, it meant he was dealing with dangerous men. It also meant that her being here wasn't random. He hadn't taken her to own her or humiliate her. He had taken her to keep her out of reach, to protect her before anyone else could use her as leverage. That night she sat in her room for a long time, thinking about the man downstairs who never raised his voice, who ran alone at dawn, and who carried a kind of sadness she didn't understand. He wasn't what the world believed he was. His quiet life, his careful movements, his secret work, they were all part of something much bigger. For the first time, Emily realized that the house that had once felt like a cage might have been a shelter all along. The storm began when everything became public. The news spread fast, and every headline twisted the story in the worst way possible. Articles called Alexander Holt a monster. They said he bought a girl, that he kept her locked in his house, that he was hiding her from the world. Reporters camped outside his gates, trying to get pictures. Social media filled with rumors. People believed what sounded the most dramatic. The companies he owned started to panic. Board members demanded answers. Investors pulled back. Partners stopped returning calls. His old friends, the ones who liked being seen with him at events, disappeared completely. For days, Emily watched from the window as journalists waited near the driveway. The house that had once been quiet now felt surrounded. Alexander didn't fight back. He didn't give interviews or make statements. He kept going into the city in his old black SUV, coming back late at night, tired but calm. He looked like a man who had already lost what mattered most and didn't care about the noise anymore. Inside the house, he went back to playing the piano. The soft sound carried through the halls, steady and slow, as if he refused to let the lies control his rhythm. Emily couldn't watch it anymore. The silence, the injustice, the way people spoke about him as if they knew him, it made her sick. She realized that if she stayed quiet, everything he had done to protect her would be for nothing. So she decided to speak. She prepared herself the best she could. She chose a simple dress and stood in front of the mirror for a long time. Her hands shook when she tied her braids the way her mother used to do when she was a child. She put on light makeup, just enough to look calm, not fragile. She didn't rehearse a speech. She only knew what she needed to say. When she stepped into the TV studio, the lights were blinding. Cameras pointed straight at her. The host introduced her by name, and for a second she almost froze. But then she took a breath and started to speak. Her voice was steady, quiet at first, but clear. She didn't defend him directly. She talked about what really happened, how easily people treat a woman's dignity like something that can be sold, and how the world looks away when it happens. She explained that Alexander Holt hadn't trapped her. He had rescued her from a deal that should never have existed. She described what it felt like to be treated as property and what it meant when someone chose to see her as a person instead. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. Every word was simple and true. When the interview aired, people reacted immediately. The story spread again, but this time in a different way. Viewers shared her words. Some apologized online, others sent messages of support. The scandal started to lose its force. Investigators shifted their focus. They stopped chasing the headlines and began looking at the men behind the fake charities and the illegal money flow. Her father's name appeared again, this time for all to see. Alexander didn't call her after the broadcast. When she returned home, he was sitting at the piano, his fingers resting on the keys. He didn't thank her or try to talk about what she had done. But she noticed something small. For the first time since she had arrived, the piano lid was open and the key to lock it was gone. The house felt lighter that night, as if the storm had passed. Time began to move differently. There were no more meetings or headlines, only small, steady days that felt real. Emily applied to a local university and started studying again. It was the first time in her life she focused on herself, not on what others wanted from her. Her mornings began with short runs in Piedmont Park. The cool air helped her breathe easier, and the routine gave her a sense of peace. She spent afternoons at her desk, typing essays on a new laptop that still smelled like new plastic. Her first paper was about how society labels people and how hard it is to remove those labels once they stick. At home, she learned to cook simple meals. The smell of cinnamon and vanilla often filled the kitchen. In the evenings, she checked her email and found messages from women across the country. They wrote to say her story had given them courage. Many of them had never spoken about their pain before. Some asked for advice, others just wanted to say thank you. The foundation that started as a small idea grew quickly. At first, it was just Emily and a few volunteers. But soon lawyers, psychologists, and social workers joined them. They helped women who needed shelter, legal aid, or safety. The website had a section where people could ask for help in just a few clicks. It became more than an organization. It became a place of hope. Alexander stayed in the background. He didn't try to take credit for anything. He helped quietly, donating resources, organizing meetings, and making sure the right people got involved. When he visited, it was never with fanfare. Sometimes he came late in the evening, after a long day, still in his work clothes. They would sit in the kitchen together, sharing warm bread or leftover salmon from dinner. He listened to her talk about her classes and the professors who were too strict. He didn't say much, but she could tell he was proud of her. Over time, she noticed small changes in him. He stopped wearing his expensive watches. He didn't check his phone constantly. He looked more relaxed, more human. The world that once demanded his attention no longer seemed to control him. When they shook hands or brushed past each other in the hallway, their touches lingered a little longer than before. The silence between them felt safe, not awkward. The house on the hill slowly came back to life. She opened the windows more often and filled the rooms with flowers from the garden, mostly hydrangeas and lilies. The fresh scent mixed with the smell of clean laundry. The rooms that had once felt empty now carried traces of daily life: books on the coffee table, a blanket left on the couch, a mug by the piano. Even the wind outside seemed softer, as if it moved in rhythm with their quiet routine. Emily didn't think of her life as perfect, but it finally felt her own. She worked, studied, and built something that mattered. And though she never said it out loud, she knew that the peace she felt wasn't just hers, it belonged to both of them. The ending came quietly, not in a courtroom or at a business event, but by the ocean. Emily and Alexander left the city without reporters or guests in fancy clothes. They drove for hours until they reached Tybee Island, a small place where the air smelled of salt and the wind never stopped moving. The church by the beach was old and simple. Its white paint had faded, and the wooden door creaked when it opened. The floorboards were uneven, but the light coming through the stained glass made everything inside look warm and peaceful. Emily wore a plain white dress. She had left her shoes in the car, and her feet sank slightly into the sand. The bottom of her dress caught the wind, and a few drops of seawater touched the fabric. She didn't care. The sound of the waves replaced music, and the air felt soft on her skin. There was no crowd, no luxury, no noise, just the people who had been part of their journey. The guests were few but meaningful. There was the lawyer who had helped expose the truth, the nurse from the shelter who always smiled even after long shifts, the college student whose rent had been paid by Emily's foundation, and an old pastor who spoke slowly and gently, blessing them with quiet words. Everyone there understood what this day meant, not glamour, but peace. Alexander stood near the altar, wearing a simple white shirt with no tie. His hair was lighter in the sunlight, and the wind kept moving it across his forehead. He looked different than he had years ago, calmer, more human. Emily walked toward him, and when their hands met, there was no nervousness. Their fingers fit easily together, like they had done it 1,000 times before. There were no grand speeches, no rehearsed vows, and no expensive decorations. The ceremony was short and sincere. The rings were plain gold, smooth and light, and when they exchanged them, no one looked away. The sound of waves covered the silence, and the guests clapped softly. Some smiled through tears, others laughed. It wasn't a perfect wedding, but it was honest. After everyone left, Emily and Alexander stayed by the water. The sun began to set, painting the ocean pink and gold. Seagulls flew low over the waves, and the air grew cooler. They stood side by side, watching the tide move in and out. Emily thought about everything she had been told growing up, that she should stay quiet, that she wasn't enough, that her worth depended on others. But life had proven them wrong. She had learned to take up space, to speak, to choose her own path. For the first time, she felt completely herself. Alexander looked at her and felt the same peace. He thought about all the years he had spent in silence, hiding behind work and money, and how strange it was that freedom had come in such a simple way. He didn't need to control anything anymore. The world could keep chasing power and stories to sell, but their story didn't belong to anyone else now. When the sky turned dark and the first stars appeared, they finally walked back to the car. Their footprints in the sand faded behind them as the tide came in. There was no music, no applause, only the sound of the ocean following them. It was quiet, and in that quiet there was something stronger than victory. There was peace. I hope you enjoyed this story. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What moved you, what surprised you, and what part stayed in your heart after the ending? Your comments mean a lot. They help me create even deeper and more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow with another one. There are so many more waiting to be told.